There was a question here about how do you respond to people if they don't believe in climate change and don't do their bit? And I want to tie this into one of those things you talk about in the book where you say, you're talking about earning the respect of those you disagree with. So
yes.
how do you earn respect of those you disagree with, and how do you win people over?
Well, I always think it's fun with these questions to look at them both in their specific contexts and in the wider contexts, because in your church gathering, and I've only just picked up on what you're about this afternoon with seeing what you've been doing, you are also trying to open people up to spiritual life. And you're also dealing with the reality that many people don't accept that spiritual reality is real and are allergic to any mention of words like Christ or God. And so it's the same goes here. So, how do we speak to anybody across the garden fence? Well, I think we have to start by listening to them. Ask them what they believe. Ask them, why do you believe that? When I encounter somebody who's a militant atheist, I say, oh, that's interesting. Why is it so important to you? And notice how notice how you can phrase a question in different ways. You can phrase a question, why is atheism, or why is denial of climate change? Why do you think like that? You can put the question into the head. Why do you think like that? And get a rational answer back. Or you can say, why do you feel like that? Why is that important to you? And you start moving it down to the head. And I would say with these arguments, I beg your pardon, for moving it down to the heart. And I would say that with these questions, that often they will start at the cerebral level. There will be intellectually framed questions. With folk who are atheists, they always put huge emphasis on their own reasoning capabilities, on their intelligence. So you need to start there, but then you start moving it down to feeling and start opening up the emptinesses there. And so similarly with climate change, why are you choosing representations of the science which make out that it's not happening? And that will generally bring you into the area of, I don't want to have my way of life constrained by a left-wing plot, that kind of stuff. And so you can start getting into somebody's, what really makes them tick and what's led them down that path, and does it really give satisfaction, or is it yet another route that can't give no satisfaction?
We got a question, thank you. We got a question from Nona, who says, how do we account for privilege in conversation on climate change? For those with access to higher incomes and time, they may be able to shop at zero waste supermarkets and make more ethical choices that often cost more money. But for those on lower incomes who have less time, it's harder to make these choices. Is it about wider social change?
Yes, it is. And you see, we try to buy organic or low impact and certainly high animal, we're not vegetarians. We try to go for high animal welfare when we eat meat or fish, the marine stewardship standard with certification with fish. And so, one of the first things that I do is I use that, I say what I've just said to signal that I'm not virtue signaling, because in a lot of green circles, people would expect me to be vegan and certainly vegetarian. And so one of the things I do when I openly confess to eating meat and fish is I use that to destabilize any sense of projection of virtue onto me. And I think that helps an awful lot in the kind of situations you're describing, where often people don't have the choice. I mean, I know people who say, a vegetarian diet is actually quite expensive. It's not necessarily a cheap diet. If you live in a place like we are, you just can't buy those kind of things in local shops. You have to go to the posh end of town. You know, my wife travels each week to another area of town. She drives about 3 miles away and fills the car. Yes, we have a car. She fills the car up with shopping in a place, a wonderful shop called Lockavo, and brings that back. But you know, it is more expensive than if we just bought it in the shop round the corner, and it didn't have those ethical standards. So how do you then relate to that? The first thing is that I noticed with neighbours who are switched on to these things, if they could afford it and get it, they would like to have it. And the second thing I do is I always emphasize that this is not, you know, it's not so much about the meat, not that I want to avoid pesticides or that kind of thing. This is about looking for higher animal welfare standards and also higher human standards in our production. So, you know, when we buy fair trade tea or coffee, why do we go for the fair trade or the fair trade bananas or whatever, which are fairly readily available? Because that's about right relationships. That's about justice. And when people see that the green agenda is also a red agenda of social justice, then especially in areas where people are on low incomes, that starts to make a lot more sense. And I should say, you know, the place that I just mentioned, Lockavo, and, you know, most of you are not in Glasgow, so this is not going to be like an advert, but, you know, it's wonderful because they give all the leftover stuff, the stuff that's going off and they can't, you know, it's date expired or whatever. They send it in to a organization, the Gallagher Trust, I'm one of those. Now, when there's not COVID, we have a regular Thursday evening community meal, and you know we cook it up, and we.
Oops. Just lost.
Am I back?
Lost the audio. There we are.
I just
You're back.
over my mic. We have a regular Thursday evening community meal.
There's a community meal. Yeah.
The Gallagher Trust, Galgael, which, you know, outwardly is about woodwork and building traditional boats and getting them out in the river and getting people to connect with nature like that. But really, it's about community, and it's about rebuilding community where community has been weakened because people don't have these embodied contexts of real presence, of togetherness.
Well, I guess then that leads really nicely onto another question, which is advice for us as a community, and perhaps this is going to be us as a community in the long term, not just thinking about the next few months, which are probably going to continue to be unusual and somewhat traumatic. But what can we do together to address some of these needs? When you have, let's say, what happens when you do have a group of people that are like-minded? What can you see happen?
What happens? So you're slightly breaking up. What happens when you have a group of like-minded people? What needs to happen?
Yeah, for example, our community here, our gathering. Okay. What can we do?
Yes. Okay. Well, are you a community of place? Are you, you know, normally without COVID, would you normally be gathering in a place, or is it all online?
Yeah, we would be gathering in a place.
Okay, so you would have real. It's not just virtual reality. It's real. Sorry.
What's happened is that we have expanded even this year to people that have come in during our Zoom church, but actually there is a core group of people that, yes, do meet together.
Okay. Parker Palmer, an American Quaker, he talks about the importance of a notice expression, holding or creating spaces that are hospitable to the soul. Spaces that are hospitable to the soul. So I think that what needs to happen in so many contexts, not just religious contexts, but other contexts too, is we need to ask ourselves, what kind of qualities do we need for a space that is hospitable to the soul, by which I mean people's deeper who they are, the innermost expressions can start to emerge. Now, I mentioned our weekly community meals in the Galgale Trust. That would be one example of that. So what happens, at 6:30 in the evening, we'll serve up a meal. It'd be a very, very simple dish. Sort of spaghetti bolognese type level of stuff. Usually very strong emphasis on nutrition. So there'll be a lot of salads, again, which is stuff we get from places like Lokovo, a lot of salads, that kind of emphasis on nutrition. And then we'll sit together, we will have a Galgale grace, so the grace that that we use. And we brought that in. Let me just see if I can pull it up on my phone as I'm speaking to you. We introduced that. It's so interesting, folks. You'll be really interested in this bit because well, let me just tell you the other bit. We have the meal, and then often there will be a sharing, a kind of just round the room, people sharing, or if we've got an interesting speaker, they might say a bit, and that will open up discussion. So, I often get interesting people come to see me, and I'll often say to them, come along on a Thursday and we'll go down to the Galgale shared meal afterwards. And I'll just say, we've got so-and-so visiting Glasgow just now, and here's what they're about. And you'll be amazed at the richness that it opens up. And then usually it kind of yields to music. Somebody will take out a guitar and people will start singing. But what I'll focus on in relation to your question, Joel, is the qualities that spiritual depth can bring. So a few years ago, we noticed that something seemed to be lacking in our community meal. And what is community? Community is this weaving together, this membership one of another, as Paul put it. That's what community is. And there seemed to be a bit of reality was coming into it. And so we talked about it, and we decided, how about if we try having a grace? So for a while we did it, where we would invite somebody to offer a grace, and it kind of worked reasonably, but not entirely well, because it's a difficult thing to do, and a grace that works for everybody. And then one of our people, a guy called Jethro Jeffrey, who's actually from somewhere around your area, somewhere in Middle England, and at the time was part of our community. He wrote this grace. Now, I'll just read it to you because I think it speaks so deeply to your question, the Galgale grace. And what we do is we hand this round on sheets. I have it on my phone here, and people can read it out if they don't know it off by heart. We're cast into a crazy world with many a sore disgrace, where greed o'erturns compassion and respect is laid to waste. Nay wonder when I linger here with brethren mere distinguished, whose grasp on human kindness has never been relinquished. And share a cup and gie a hand to those who share this greeting, to be a Kent faith and earn a place at Galgale's weekly meeting. So as we eat, let all think well of the value of this clan that feeds our bodies, hearts and minds and helps us make our stand. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks.
And you can just imagine the room full of people, maybe, typically between 30 and 50 people at these meals. And you can just imagine, and in that final culmination, everybody really powering it up. And
yeah.
And then it takes off. Then you've got the holding. Then you've built the ground. You've let grace in.
Now, I think I don't see. I love how you consistently intertwine the science and spirituality. These two things are bedfellows. They don't need to be different. They don't need to be on opposite spectrum. Science and spirituality.
Let me see that first. Is the what in spirituality?
Science.
Science. Sorry. Science.
Yes.
Sorry. Beg your pardon.
So,
yeah.
But I think a part of the reason why you perhaps have a different stance to others is that you have actually been in battles with big corporations, and you have been and not just you, but your company you have been successful. So stopping the super quarry from being built. So when someone's question is about this overwhelming sense of a mismatch of power when you're pitted against big corporations, but maybe you don't see it the same way, that there's some other power at work. So can you tell us about your experience of being up against big powers and what has happened?
Yes, I think the first, thing here, Joel, is a health warning, because I get asked to give a lot of talks because people will have read Soil and Soul, where I talk about the super quarry battle and also the campaign that brought the Isle of Egg into community ownership, both in the 1990s. And then I'll maybe mention something like Gal Gale, which has been successful. And my health warning is always, most activism ends on the cross. In most activism, we are working with lost causes that fail and end in tears and suffering. And this is where I draw a lot on Hindu thinking, on the Bhagavad Gita, the Karma Yoga, the sacred, or one of the sacred texts of Hinduism. At the moment, we're in Diwali, the Hindu festival of light, which is the triumph of good over evil, of light over darkness, and of knowledge over ignorance. Okay, and what I learned from that tradition, and I am a believer that all faiths based on love will have something to bring to the table of our understanding. The Gita talks about acting without being bound by the consequences of your action. So when I went into those campaigns, in my mind, I was giving them a 5% chance of success. And they happened to come out trumps, that we stopped the super quarry, we got egg into community land ownership, and there are now some 500 land trusts in Scotland and nearly 3% of Scottish land community owned. But the first thing I say to people is, if you're going to go down this path, don't do it assuming you're going to succeed. Remember that in worldly terms, Jesus was a failure. He ended up where he ended up. And it takes a lot of faith to see beyond that into the resurrection. So don't do activism out of the hope that you are going to succeed, because you will only face the desolation and the multiple knockbacks that you will inevitably experience. Having said that health warning, what do you do? I think a starting point is feed the hungry, literally or metaphorically. Look to where the need is greatest. In my book with Matt Carmichael, Spiritual Activism, Leadership as Service, we tell the story of the young Mahatma Gandhi, who turned up at Congress. He turned up at, there we go, this one from Green Books. And that's a nice kind of Hindu image that a local woman here in the Galgil Trust created of the activists climbing the lotus. So, coming up from the roots, the grassroots, the stem of the lotus representing the waters of the unconscious, and then blossoming out into the jewel in the heart of the lotus, Om Mani Padme Hum, Om, God, cosmic wholeness, is when the Mani, the diamond of the mind, is rested into the Padme, the lotus of the heart, undivided. In other words, rest your intellect into the heart of God, and then you will know God. That is the meaning of Om Mani Padme Hum. And so, clip my microphone back on. So, the young Gandhi turns up at Congress and he says, I want to help with the Indian independence movement. And the secretary says to him, look, we have hundreds of young Indians come every day. We don't need anybody else. And Gandhi says, I will do whatever needs most doing. And the Congress secretary stops everybody, calls everybody's attention in the office, and he says, look at this young man. He's just come in, and he said he will do whatever most needs doing to help the movement. If we have more like him, India will become independent. So my advice to Jewel, to young activists, Jewel, is be of service, leadership of service. Christ's example of servant leadership. The first shall be last and the last shall be first. Christ's example of servant leadership. And then see where that takes you. You know, until I was about the age 40, I didn't lead activist campaigns. I followed. I looked for people who I felt it was worth serving. And I gave service. As I got older, I found then I was called more into leadership positions. And now I find myself in this kind of position of a teaching position. In terms of power dynamics, one of the most central teachings of nonviolent action is that power will emerge from unexpected places. And so walk lightly with power. Be very careful of playing a conventional game of trying to outpower your opponent, because then you start being dragged down the instrumentalism of violence. Aim to do your work in a way that transforms. It stands up against injustice. It says, no, stop. You will not abuse this. You will not do this, stop. But in pushing back, put a hand behind so that if your opponent, and I often use the expression worthy opponent, if your opponent falls, you're catching them, because at the end of the day, we've got to bring everybody back into the basket of the community. You know, and unless we believe in a binary division between heaven and hell, between the damned and the elect, and unless that is our theology, at the end of the day, we are all participants in the divine nature. We are all branches on the vine of life. We are all Buddha nature. We're all parts of the parthenogenetic goddess, the divine feminine that, you know, you cut it down, but she's like a mountain, on and on, old and strong. You can't kill the spirit. And remember that in the Hebrew Bible, ruach, the spirit, is feminine gendered. You can't kill the spirit, on and on, old and strong. She is like a mountain.
Beautiful. Just on a slightly lighter note, someone just wants to know.
Oh, I'm just having to enjoy myself, Jill.
I mean, this is light, but it is also kind of tied in with what you're saying, which is someone wanted to ask whether you were a church attender, and if so, what brand?
Whether I was a what?
A church attender.
A church attender. Well, I'm a Quaker.
Yeah.
I was raised in the Presbyterian tradition. I was raised. I grew up on the Isle of Lewis. My father was a doctor there in an agricultural and fishing community. And that's where the Isle of Lewis and the Outer Hebrides. That's where I feel my main anchoring to come from. So that was Church of Scotland, but in a community that was also very heavily Free Church of Scotland, which is more conservative Calvinist than the mainstream Church of Scotland. And then when I was 22, I applied to do voluntary service overseas. And of all things, I got sent to a Catholic mission, staffed by a retired Australian archbishop and 4 missionary of Teresa nuns. So you imagine going from the highly Presbyterian Isle of Lewis to a Roman Catholic mission station, and it was just a wonderful, enriching experience, that interdenominational experience. And then when I got home, I found that conventional churchianity, as I saw it, wasn't really speaking to me, and I had become very moved by the philosophy of nonviolence. So I became a Quaker. I found out about the Quakers, and I found my home in the Quakers. But I very much see myself as interfaith and interdenominational. There is only one. I'm saying that Nettie's there, Nettie's Derbyshire. She's smiling, laughing away at that. She knows exactly what I'm talking about. There is only one, what I call the underlying undivided church, the underlying undivided church. And I believe that crosses faith boundaries too. I do think we mustn't make our Jesus too small. We've got to look up at the universe, and we've got to say, scientifically, it's reasonable to believe that this kind of evolution of an advanced species is probably happening in many different places. Maybe has happened, maybe has yet to happen. That's perfectly reasonable scientifically. And we've got to, it's not just the whole world he's got in his hand, it's the whole universe. And the Orthodox, they really understand this with their, just looking around, see if I've got the icon here. No, not immediately. The icon, if you look at it, of the Pantocrator. Oh, sorry, that's that's right. The Pantocrator, of the icon of Mary. Oh, I know where it is. It's, oh my goodness me! Look, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do something. My mother-in-law paints icons, and she's French. She's French Reformed Church, French Calvinist, but she gave me this. And
classic Alastair.
We've not yet opened it up. But I'm just going to, I think the occasion calls for this. Pantocrator, the Tocrator, the bearer, and Pan of all. The Virgin Mary as the Christ carrier, the carrier of all. Let me just... this has been, can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can.
We've been waiting to put this up for a while now. We've just found the right moment, but just look at the
wow!
Look at the beauty. You see?
Yeah, you get that. That needs to go up.
And the tenderness, the tenderness. The Pantocrator icon would have a holding Christ. And she's holding Le Seigneur fit pour moi de merveilles saintes et son nom. God makes for me the holy miracles in his name.
So she's pregnant there.
God has made for me a miracle in my name.
She is actually pregnant in that image, isn't she?
I'm sorry?
She's
well, you see, in the Orthodox tradition, and I do, where are we? I got a book, where did I put it? Here we are. I got a book, on the Orthodox tradition, just arrived the other day, Light Through Darkness. The reason I got that book is that It's written by one of the co-authors of this edited collection from the Orthodox tradition, Towards an Ecology of Transfiguration.
Oh. An
Ecology of Transfiguration. This is an edited collection by that scholar John Chryssavgis, Chryssavgis, and Bruce Foltz. And that is, if you want deep theology, Eastern Christian theology, Orthodox theology, that's the one to go for. And in the Orthodox tradition, they say that when you gaze into the icon, you're gazing into the real presence. Now, when we opened that icon in church, right? May you all send your blessing on it. Some years ago, I'm not going to pull that down off the wall, it's too big. So some years ago, I don't know if you can, no, I'm going to mess my camera up. Some years ago, my wife and I were invited to speak about land reform in the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. And we got taken to the Holy Trinity Sergiev Monastery outside of Moscow. And there, they showed us around the Museum of Icons. And it was a young Russian Orthodox cleric that curated the collection. And, he would show us around, and, he would come to an icon like that, and he would kiss the icon, okay? Was that on camera? I don't know. Anyhow, you get the spirit.
Just about, almost.
You see, I'm going to be fired by all my Presbyterian friends now. And that's the point, because I said to him, I said, where I come from, we would consider that to be idolatrous. What's your take on that? And I was able to say it because he was well educated in world theological traditions. He wouldn't be offended by me asking the question. And he said, well, I'll tell you. He said, it's like when you kiss a photograph of your wife. It's not the paper that you're kissing. It's what's behind it. Mm. And I think what you see there is a take on sacramentality. It's not the wine or the piece of bread, but that which is behind it, the body and blood in the Christian tradition. And then you say, well, what about transubstantiation? And I say, well, I have no problem with transubstantiation. We're talking about an ecology of transfiguration. You see, that when you think of it, real presence means that the presence of the creator of all, the presence of the divine creator, permeates all things. What's that passage in the beginning of Hebrews, that Hebrews 1:3, I think, he sustains all things by his presence. Present in all things. The way that I think of it, on occasion, as Quakers, we don't have things like Holy Communion. But when I go to other churches that do, I participate if I'm invited to, and if I feel comfortable with the context, which I don't always. If it's an authoritarian context, I don't feel comfortable with it, and I just stand back. But if it's an inclusive gathering, then I will participate in it. And the way that I see it is, the body of Christ, the fabric, the material fabric of the universe, the blood of Christ, the spirit that permeates through and animates that fabric of the universe. That's how I understand it in my mind. And then my Quaker friends will say, well, we don't have that kind of thing. And I'll say, yeah, but the trouble with us Quakers is we forget these things because we don't have these rituals. We all too easily forget our own theology. And so it's actually very helpful. I find it's very helpful now and then to attend other people's services and just to experience these things and sometimes be reminded of what we might otherwise have forgotten.
Thank you. That was I love the way that question just blossomed out into a quite ecumenical an ecumenical yeah, it's beautiful.
But that's
now,
that's a living that's a living thing, isn't it? It's
what I'm just going to do briefly is I'm just going to check in with people, right? We don't have any kind of like finishing time for this, so we're going to just keep on going.
Yeah, keep going.
If you need to leave for any reason, that's
I'm
fine.
good for I'm good for another hour, folks. And
it's easy to talk. I mean, it's these are things we're excited about. These are things that we are passionate about. So yeah. I'm gonna ask a few more questions. One which you actually address in your book, but maybe you can talk about very briefly is in the last few years, Extinction Rebellion has clearly shook a lot of people up and actually got people thinking about green issues. But what do you think of their tactics, and do you think they are the right way forward?
Mm-hmm. I mean, you're probably aware of the debate that's been going on there around tactics since Roger Hallam, the main conceptualizer of Extinction Rebellion, certainly one of the 2-3 key masterminds, kind of has conducted himself in ways that have caused embarrassment to many of the members, including his people, his Burning Pink political party, smashing up the Green Party headquarters and daubing paint over the premises of things like Amnesty International, Christian Aid, Greenpeace, because they were not doing enough to challenge the lack of political climate action. You're probably aware of that kind of thing that has been going on. And the way that I see it, and I've spoken on a number of occasions at Extinction Rebellion rallies here in Scotland. The way that I see it is that in 2018 into 2019, it did important work in raising general consciousness of the issues. But the activism, because of the anarchy that the organization allows, because anybody could set up an Extinction Rebellion group and do their stuff in the name of Extinction Rebellion, there was no control over the message, or inadequate control over the messaging. And so you had the thing like, that thing at the London railway station where they were on top of the commuter train and the commuters were saying, but hang on, we thought we were meant to be using the train. You've had a number of in my view, badly targeted actions that have generated publicity, but have not generated public support. And as a consequence of this, public support for Extinction Rebellion has massively declined. So, and I give the exact figures in my book as quoted by Rupert Reed. I forget exactly what they were, but it's hugely dramatic. I mean, basically, public support has largely evaporated, whereas at the peak it had been at about 36%. I think it fell down to about 5% or something like that. And so you can hardly say that it has continued to work. So how do we make sense of that? And, you know, being somewhat long in the tooth, I think back to the various waves of particularly anti-nuclear weapon activism that I've been involved in, and how you'd always see a rising of momentum, and it would reach a peak, and then it would fall into decline. So I kind of always felt that this was inevitably going to happen with Extinction Rebellion, that it would peak and decline. But the sort of crazy carry on with Roger Hallam has exacerbated that in quite a severe way. So I find myself asking a lot, how do we think about that? And the way that I see it, Joel, is that most of us come into activism not very well informed, obviously driven by heart, but with head not very much in places yet. Perhaps not very strategic about it. Perhaps, you know, playing out our own personal psychology and need to rebel against authoritarian parents or something like that, mixed in with our activism. And so we come into activism at the splashy, shouty end of the pool. And I kind of think that is fine. That's where it's got to start, because that's where we come from when we are starting. But we have got to start deepening our activism. In any movement, you've got to deepen the activism from that splashy end, so that you learn, you know, having ventured to paddle, you start learning to swim, and then you move out into deeper water and you learn to dive, and eventually you learn how to breathe underwater. And so the way that I'm seeing it is that our activism needs to deepen in our analysis of what is going on in the world. And that's why I've written this book. That's why I've written a book which focuses on the IPCC mainstream science and says it is quite alarming enough without needing to exaggerate it by being alarmist, or without playing it down by being denialist. And then I move through looking at issues like the tyranny of structurelessness in many of our activist movements, not just XR. I say, how do we address that? And I suggest that spiritual discernment has a central place to play in guiding our activism. And then I take it even deeper into what in my subtitle here I've called this, the survival of being, the survival of being. What is it in our human beingness that needs to not just survive, but thrive? And I close the book by speaking of the qualities of human beingness that we need to see ourselves through, come what may, in the come to pass. So I'm seeing Extinction Rebellion as having drawn people in at that shallow end of the pool, but as you know, as I think many of its activists would agree, and especially now, having seen how there's been some damage done to the movement over recent months, since November last year, when Roger Hallam started making his comments about the Holocaust. And you're probably aware of all of that kind of stuff in the German press, which played out. I think there's a lot of us now of the need that happens through Extinction Rebellion, or whether it happens through other types of organizing that people move into, I cannot say. What I would say that there's many lessons to be learned.
Yeah.
And we don't do we don't do activism any favors if we try to hide from those lessons and not talk about these things.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna let bring in David.
So can I ask you that?
Yeah.
Is it possible, Joel, for people at this stage, with not so many people here, is it possible for them to ask their own questions so we can?
I mean, absolutely. I'm asking other people's. I am asking other people's questions. It is other people's questions I'm asking. But
okay, right. Okay.
I will allow.
Okay,
I'm just going to allow David to come in and talk a little about his experience with Extinction Rebellion. So, what have you got to say, Dave?
Yeah. So for me, yeah. So hi, Alastair. I'm an engineer and I'm passionate about environmental things. So I changed my job a few years ago to work for a large utility company trying to do really good stuff in, with a good environmental view of how we can turn the UK net zero. Involved with lots of things with that. One of the things that has really frustrated me about some of the...
You're back.
Yeah. One of the things that's really frustrated me in my role is...
Okay, sorry, that's right. I missed the beginning, David, so start again.
Yep.
And I'm going to move myself onto data. It's Sunday evening, so people are downloading stuff. Carry on, David. Sorry.
Go on there, David.
Yeah. So I moved to work for a large company who are trying to do good things, really good net zero targets, really good things in Britain to help achieve net zero. One of the things that's frustrated me about things like Extinction Rebellion, etc., is that there are structures in place. We might not like how the government works, but they do things like consultation. So, for example, I've been involved with things where we've gone and we've come up with a really good thing that can connect up loads of renewable electricity, really help towards the net zero targets. But because outside there were people with placards, but when you look at actually what the consultation responses were, they were from all sorts of other organisations, and they weren't from the people outside with placards. If they filled in the online forms and responded to the government consultations, and anyone could do this, all the people on this call, the regulators to do with energy, etc., they do loads of consultations. Anyone can input to those, and the more people that input to those, saying things positive for the environment, the more action there is. So I've been in rooms where I've not had that stuff approved because there's people outside with placards, but that hasn't actually been the official responses. And that for me is sort of, people like XR have missed an opportunity that actually, if they got everyone outside to fill in a response, then suddenly we're flooded with all these things saying, yes, let's go for these projects that connect up renewable electricity. Do you see what I mean? I wonder what your view is on that sort of responding to the structures we already have, where we can make a difference.
Yes. I mean, from what I understand, Extinction Rebellion's policy has been to say it's not for us to come up with the answers. It is for us to demand that government takes action. Now, to demand do something, but without saying what should be done and how it adds up with what can be done, and whether that can be done within a democratic framework or whether it would require authoritarian politics, to me, that's not going deep enough. So, from what I'm hearing you saying, David, you're urging people to move into the deeper level of the pool.
I'm suggesting people actually fill in responses and look at the ideas that are there, because that influences government policy and government yes or no to these projects.
And of course, you can't do that unless you start educating yourself. You can't fill in a form like that unless you start educating yourself as to what the issues are, so you know what you are asking for. So this question of how do you get agency is so important. I'm seeing Naomi with her hand up there, who's obviously got something to say here. But the question of, if we're not just going to have our wheels spinning around in the sand, kicking up a lot of dust, which soon blows away. If we're not just going to do that, we need to ask how we're going to get real traction. And that's where we've got to move into the deeper water there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to add, this is a conversation. So myself and Daniel work for the Red Letter Christians network in the UK, and something that we talk about a lot is actually it's in kind of the conventional term, it's easier to be an activist instead of being a community organizer. So it's easier to spread a message than it is to kind of build the groundswell and engage people on a community level. And it's not that we don't need both, but I think a lot of what has come out, especially in terms of, being able to get messages out there quicker and more easier than ever before is that it's all about the messaging and nothing other than that kind of thing, that there isn't enough going on the community level to build support, understanding, and I think as well that's kind of where XR and other movements have fallen into the trap of then creating these kind of quite privileged in a lot of ways networks as well, is that those movements are then accessible to people who have the resources and have the ability to spread kind of the messages and everything else and engage, but then other people are left behind. Like there was a big thing around people being arrested and then that not being something that's suitable for people of colour to put themselves in that much danger. Like way more thought has to go into it for them. And yeah, I think that just generally when we're talking about having privilege in movements, then I kind of see it as on us as people with privilege to use that to grow and empower other people, the power in the unexpected places, rather than taking it necessarily on ourselves to be the spearhead of things. And that's something that I'm wrestling with a lot, because obviously I'm a leader in a movement and so it's how balancing that is something that I find really challenging. But yeah, I've gone off on one now, but
no, I get that. So just to chip in with that, Naomi, as well, one thing that like locally for me, we've had all that stuff around cycle lanes and everything else, and we've got a lot of car lobby saying we've got traffic jams, we might get rid of all these cycle lanes. It would be great if everyone who was interested in XR, everyone who was interested in the environment got on and like in Solihull got onto the thing. In Birmingham, they're doing the same thing. You don't need any cash to do that. You do need access to a computer. That's a good way that we can say, actually, we do want these walking spaces. We do want these cycling spaces. We just need to fill in and be a bigger voice than the people in their cars moaning because they've got a 30-second delay on their journey, which is currently what it was on all those things. So there's that side to it, and that can be organised as a community, or it can be individuals as well, can't it?
The Galgale Trust, which I've been talking about, where we've got a workshop where we build boats and all of that kind of thing, it actually started off as the Pollock Free State M77 motorway protest. And so this was the 1990s. You had all those motorway protests down in England in the 1990s. And we had this big one in Glasgow with the M77. And basically, just folk camping up in tree houses and all of that kind of stuff, and spiking the trees, and you'll know all of the kind of scene from that important era in activism. And then when it got to the stage around the mid-1990s, when it was clear that the motorway was going to be driven through anyway, although the subsequent election of the Blair government caused a rollback on that motorway program. So the war was won, but battles were lost. When it became clear that the battle we were involved in was lost and the motorway was going to be driven through, the co-founder was his wife, Jehan, Colin MacLeod, who co-founded the Galgale Trust, but had also led the motorway protest. He said, okay, folks, we've shown them what we're against. Now let's show them what we're for. We've shown them what we're against. Now let's show them what we're for. It's a question of push and pull tactics. And I think that this is where we're at with climate change just now, that what was happening in 2018 through to 19 was showing them what we're against. And XR at its best, and Greta Thunberg, raised huge consciousness in doing that. But now we've got to show them what we're for. It's kind of like, we've had the era of Jesus living, now we've got to go and build the church. What did the Buddha do? He went out and he sat underneath a tree. He went to nature. He received enlightenment. He didn't just sit under the tree with his enlightenment. He did a third thing. He went out and formed the noble Sangha, the community. He formed the community. And so to me, when people say, what can we do? I say it all boils down to community. Get out and in whatever way, constellate community. Hold spaces that are hospitable to the soul. I'm not hearing you, Joel.
You're on mute, Joe.
Joel, you're muted.
Sorry. I'm just going to say, I'm going to open it up for everyone to ask a question. Maybe that is a question that has not been asked yet. So if you have a question, just indicate that I want to say something, and I'll unmute you. We're probably going to go for another like 15 minutes, but we'll continue with Rachel and see what happens. Here we go. Rachel, there you go. And then after Rachel, David.
Thanks. Best conversation ever. Thanks so much, Alastair. I'm scribbling notes as fast as I can. I had a question earlier on in the chat, which is a lot of my work is kind of a mixture of, I've done some international development stuff before, and now I work in public health, and a chunk of that pre-COVID is climate, of course, as the biggest global threat to health. But it tends to feel quite lifeless at the levels that I get involved at it. So it was just really any thoughts you have on how you can be working at a strategy policy type world that's sometimes quite corporate, but bring some of those other beautiful elements that you're talking about the spirituality, but ultimately the belonging to one another and to place, which seems to be missing.
Thank you, Rachel. I think it's, such an important reflection, how to be in the world but not of the world. And it's such a temptation sometimes to withdraw ourselves from the world. And there can be a place for doing that. I was talking to Father Dara Molloy, a Celtic, he was Catholic monk, he then married and now calls himself a Celtic monk on the Aran Islands in County Galway the other day on the phone. And Dara, who's a long-term thinker and community activist, has been instrumental in setting up a renewable energy system on the islands to make themselves more self-sufficient in power. Dara was saying that, in studying the Celtic monks and nuns, they didn't go out to try and change the world. They worked on changing themselves, and then the world changed around them. Now, I found that very interesting because I end Riders in the Storm with the final chapter is called The Rainmakers. And I'll tell you the story quickly. It's a story that Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychotherapist, it was his favorite story. And it was about his friend, Richard Wilhelm, who was a German Protestant missionary professor missionary in China in the 1920s, and who some of you may have heard of because of his translations of the I Ching, ancient Chinese oracle that Jung considered summed up Chinese indigenous wisdom. And when Wilhelm was out there for many years as a missionary, one of those missionaries who proudly didn't convert anybody much because he saw that they were already there in many ways. There was a terrible drought in the province. And the plants started to die and the animals started to die and the people knew that they would be next. And so in desperation, they called on the Protestant missionaries, who came and made their prayers and gave their long sermons, but no rain. So then they turned to the Catholic missionaries who turned up with their rosary beads and sprinkling holy water and no rain. So then they turned to their indigenous Confucian and Taoist shamanic priests who came and set off guns and fireworks to frighten away the evil spirits that had caused the drought. but no rain. And finally, interestingly, as a last resort, they called the Rainmaker. Now, the Rainmaker was a wizened little old man who had to walk some days' travel from a neighboring province. And when he arrived, they asked him what he wanted. He said, I need nothing, I just need a hut to go and sit in. The Rainmaker sat in his hut for 3 days and 3 nights. 40 days and 40 nights. You've got the outer life of consciousness and the inner life of the unconscious and the spiritual realm. The days and nights, 3 days and 3 nights, the Rainmaker sat in his hut, whereupon there was an unseasonable fall of snow that melted to yield rain, and the drought was relieved. Now, the Chinese quickly got back to their usual business, but Wilhelm, being a professor, and not just any old professor, but a German professor of Protestant theology, he wanted to know what had happened. So he caught up with the Rainmaker before he left and said, what did you do? I did nothing, said the Rainmaker. Oh, come on, says Wilhelm. Were you making magic spells or incantations? No, said the Rainmaker, no magic spells, no incantations. Oh, come on, said Wilhelm. Then did you just hit it lucky that you only had to wait 3 days and 3 nights until it rained? It wasn't that either, said the Rainmaker. Then what was it, said Wilhelm. It's like this, said the Rainmaker. When I was in my own province, my spirit was in the Tao, or Tao, the Chinese understanding of the cosmic wholeness of all things, out of which the 100,000 things break out in the interplay of yin and yang. When I was in my own province, my spirit was in the Tao. But when I came to this province, I found my spirit was no longer in the Tao. And that's why I asked for a hut to go and sit there until my spirit settled back into the Tao. And then the rain came. So I put it to you, it was Naomi that asked the question, wasn't it? Yep. No, who asked the question?
Rachel.
Rachel, beg your pardon, shifted on my screen. I put it to you, Rachel. I put it to you, be still and know that I am good. That no matter where you are working, seek to embody that presence. You don't need to evangelize, you don't need to pontificate and so on, but just hold yourself in that presence. I saw on Twitter last week, somebody mentioned a Buddhist story in which the monk walked through the fires of hell unscathed. Walked through the fires of hell unscathed. And I thought to myself, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no ill, for thou art with me, and thy rod and staff me comfort still, at least in the Scottish version of the 23rd Psalm. Thou art with me with thy rod. I take that to be the mace, the symbol of power, of spiritual power. And staff, the staff, the shepherd by which you lead. Remember that in Middle East, the shepherd doesn't bribe the sheep with dogs. The shepherd walks out with a staff and leads the sheep to water. And the sheep know that the shepherd will take them to where the grazing and the water is. It's a different paradigm that we often miss in the West. And so I would put it to you, Rachel, that, whatever the fires of hell you might be walking through, whatever the blandness, constellate that presence. You know, when I find myself in such situations, you know, I'll often use other kind of mantra, be still and know that I am God. When I find myself losing it because I'm getting drawn into their psyche, into their mindsets, again, I'll try and ground myself. When I was when I came back from Papua New Guinea in 1980, I traveled overland and, of course, wanted to do something of the old hippie trails. We went to Darjeeling, and one day there was a knock on the boarding house door, and this old man from Sikkim, just over the border, was selling trinkets, and he had a prayer wheel, and he was spinning it round, Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum. And I said to him, what does that mean? Now, as we discussed earlier, I already knew something of what that meant. But you know what he said? He had these brilliant sky blue eyes. He looked at me and he said, that means, God, come to my heart. God, come to my heart. And I use that as a mantra. Om Mani Padme Hum. God is when the Mani, the diamond of the mind, settles into the holding of the lotus, the Padme of the heart. When our intellects and our hearts are in the same place as hum, undivided. God, come to my heart. God, come to my heart. And so when I find myself feeling unsettled, as quite often happens, activism is always not just activism is a very everyday thing. Activism is challenging a colleague. Activism is saying, you know, I don't actually agree with this course of action. I think we'd be doing that. It's a very everyday thing in the nitty-gritty of it. And when I find myself losing it, be still and know that I am God. God, come to my heart. God, come to my heart.
Thanks.
That's the best I can say to you, Rachel. And you see, I think this is where your spiritual contexts are so important. You know, not my kingdom come, but thy kingdom come. Thy, or as I like to translate it, thy community come. You know, what is the kingdom? It is the community of the realm. So you know, let's do the necessary translation. Thy community come. Thy will. What is meant by divine will, what is meant is, you know, in the Eastern terms, the Dharma, the way, the truth, and the life. Thy opening of the way be revealed. Thy community come. Thy opening of the way be revealed unto us on earth as is in heaven. The Rainmaker's role is to ground what comes from the heavens. Goodness, I'm making this up as I go along, Joel. Just in response to Rachel's question, but I hadn't thought of it like that. You know, the Rainmaker's role is to ground what the rain that comes from heaven on earth.
Thank you. I'm gonna open this up to 2 more people. David Derbyshire, I'm going to unmute you. Do you want to ask a question?
Yes, I think my question fits in a little bit with the thy kingdom come aspect, in that I just want to ask about the survival of being that you're talking about, and the possibility of humanity not surviving is, you know, something quite a disturbing thought, and I'm just wondering how that fits in with the you know, things like Christian eschatology and Jesus teaching on the kingdom, that the kingdom would grow like a plant, grow bigger and bigger and fill the whole earth, and that we look forward to the coming of the Son of Man in the future, and resurrection of the dead, and how all that fits together with this disturbing thought that we might not survive, and that the world might not end up in that direction. I'm just wondering if, for your wisdom and thoughts on those fit together in that sort of bigger picture of the prayer for your kingdom to come.
Well, when I do these things, folks, I tend not to pay much notice to the chat. Otherwise, I find I'm in two places between watching your faces on the screen, and I mean, I'm caught between head and heart too much if I do that. But I did notice, David, because you came in right at the beginning with your question that summarizes that: how can we understand climate change in the context of Christian eschatology?
Yeah.
And the return of Jesus? And that question particularly, I think it's a very pivotal question, if I can just catch breath a bit and reflect on that. It's an important question with climate change, because there is a view in some Christian circles, and where I come from on the Isle of Lewis, some of the more conservative evangelical preachers teach this view that we are living in end times now, and that the stand by for the rapture kind of thing. There's no point doing anything about it because it's all part of God's plan. And you see that very much in the kind of the Donald Trump type of evangelicalism that you have in America. So, the first thing is inviting riders in the storm. I have a section called Climate Millenarianism. Millenarianism, the end of the millennium, the end of the world, the end of the era, basically. I have a section on that where I discuss it. And I was drawing on, do I still have the books? Where did I put those books that I was drawing on for that? I reshelved them the other day. But I was drawing on some of the key studies of cults, of millenarian movements. And I've forgotten where I put them. I just rearranged my stuff the other day. Otherwise, I could show you what I'm talking about. Here we are, books like this, Expecting the End. Okay, so the first thing I would point out is that in any application, you got the guy there saying Jesus is Lord, and he's holding up the cross, and it's subtitled Millennialism in Social and Historic Context, and I've got several others somewhere knocking around up there. The first thing I'd draw your attention to is that there is a whole social psychology around this, and that's why in spiritual activism, Matt and I put a chapter in called Understanding Cults and Charisma. That we should only work with charisma, with the power of the Holy Spirit, the gifts of the Holy Spirit. That's what a charism is, a spiritual gift. Yeah. If we understand we are working with spiritual power, and that power is not ours, not my kingdom come, but thy community come. Okay, that's the first thing. And so, let's get our act together on understanding the social psychology of it, and seeing that for a very long time in Christian and other religious history, you've got a pattern of this kind of behavior that becomes an abuse of power too easily. That's the first thing to understand. But then taking it deeper, there is the question of what do we mean by Christian eschatology? Now, eschatology means end things, the study of the end. In other words, what's the big show all about? In the grand finale, before the curtain comes down on the cosmic opera, what's going to be the denouement of what it's all been about? That's what eschatology here. Why did Christ come to earth? Why did he die? What is the meaning? How might we understand resurrection, to frame it in a Christian context? And I from having seen your service tonight, I kind of see where you're coming from. So I'm primarily, I'm not so much doing the Hindu, well, I've done some of that, but I'm focusing on the Christian tonight. It's because it's very powerful. It's very powerful. And you know, what interests me, I've just got here where we, Luke 17:21 is one of my favorites here. Where's Luke gone? Come here, Luke. Here we are. The coming of the kingdom. Some Pharisees asked Jesus when the kingdom of God. Some Pharisees asked Jesus when the kingdom of God would come. His answer was, "The kingdom of God does not come in such a way as to be seen. No one will say, 'Look, here it is,' or 'There it is,' because the kingdom of God is among you or within you." It's the Greek that's being translated there can be translated as either among or within. And I would suggest we need both. That's the Good News translation that I like, because you know, how do you reach people with this? I bulk buy these. You can bet them, you know, a pack of 10, and I use the Good News version because it's, you know, there's you know, there's the wonderful illustration. If you're not familiar with this version, the wonderful illustrations done by a Swiss woman. And so I tell you not to worry. I tell you not to worry. I use this and just have a few of these handy, especially if I'm doing like retreats and so on, to help lead people in. And so, you know, we're being told that we're dealing with an order of reality in the parousia, the second coming. The Greek parousia, par meaning as in parallel lines, alongside. Ousia, a word that means essence, alongside the essence of God. When the essence of God comes alongside, we're being told in that passage from Luke, it's not going to be something like, you know, there it is, or it's coming next week, or whatever. So I would say that on scriptural grounds alone, never mind my, you know, the social psychological grounds I just mentioned, on scriptural grounds alone, be very wary of anybody who says these are signs of end times coming. Yes, you can find that theology. You'll find that theology, especially in the book of Revelation. You will also find it in Jesus. And note the embarrassing factor. The embarrassing factor, as pointed out by people like, you know, the Jesus Seminar people here. You know this book here, the Jesus Seminar, the group of scholars that got together to vote on how likely certain scripture passages were to have been said by Jesus and how likely not. The 5 Gospels, but that includes Thomas in what they call the scholars' translation. I've got a little gnome, by the way, that, you know, just provides me the very book I happen to need at a reach of my hand here. He scurries around and, you know, runs downstairs and brings them up, and always just got the right thing there. Okay, so how do we understand this parousia? And Jesus is telling us right there in that passage, the realm of heaven, the community of heaven, is all around. It's in our hearts. Now, this is what in technical terms is called a realized eschatology. Realized, made real now. Self-realization in psychology, self-realization is the making real of the self, the survival of being. The survival and thriving of being. I use the term survival for a particular reason in the book there, but the survival and thriving of being. So that return of Jesus that is being talked about is in our hearts. You know, Jesus has returned whenever and wherever the Spirit of Christ is alive in us. How do we bring that alive in us? Well, it's not for us to do. It's not something we do. It's not something we buy or trade or do good works for and so on. we simply ask, God, come to my heart, as the old man in Sikkim said. Om Mani Padme Hum. God, come to my heart. Come to my heart. I can't put it better than that. Thy realm, thy kingdom come. Yeah.
I'm going to ask one. I'm going to have one more question. Martin, I don't know when you want to chip in now.
Yeah, I can do that.
And then I think after this we're gonna close it up. There's so much to think about. It's quite overwhelming in a good way.
We're only starting to. We're only getting going. Aye.
So Martin.
Yeah.
Thank you. Personally, I could keep going all night. Alastair, thank you so much for singing to my heart and soul and mind and being. It's wonderful. It might be quite a relief because this is quite a light kind of question, unusual for me. But I was just wondering, at the risk of sounding like a Sunday Times Sunday supplement kind of journalist question, is there a space or a place or a time that you occupy that is particularly feeding to you? Where do you seek, or where do you get your nourishment from? I mean, it sounds like there's so many things you've already shared that is clearly in you that does that. But is there a particular space in the world, or places and times that you go to for your own deepening, your own nourishment, and your own clarity? I think, or inspiration.
So good. You know, a journalist once met George MacLeod, founder of the Iona community and minister in this parish, waiting to take the ferry over to Iona when he was leading the Iona community that he had founded. And the journalist said, "So how does it feel, Lord MacLeod? It must be wonderful every time you head back to Iona." And George, who had been twice decorated for bravery in the First World War, before he became a pacifist, said, "It feels like getting back into the trenches." Because when we really do the spiritual work, it's not about the bells and smells. It's about the cold face of working with the shadow of ourselves, our colleagues, our organizations, the shadow in the Jungian sense, the side that we repress, the side we are in denial of. So the first part of my answer to your question is be wary of projecting expectations that, you know, if only we could all be on Iona just now, or if only we were meeting in person, then it would all be perfect. You might just be climbing back into the trenches. And for me, you know, there's this expression that C.S. Lewis used in the book about his wife dying, surprised by joy. I forget where he was getting it from. I think it might, I can't remember, but that expression, for me, the place and the space and the time is constantly being surprised by joy. Constantly little encounters on the bus where, you know, or walking down the street, where you might find opportunity for an interaction with somebody, or where something might happen that suddenly takes you by surprise. No, I won't bother reading that. I was going to read you a passage in Poacher's Pilgrimage, but when we reach the end now, that'll take too long. Constantly, look, I'll tell you the parable of the microwave ovens. Okay, the parable of the microwave ovens. This is a very embarrassing parable. It's another one that knocks me off any pedestal you might have put me onto, because we have a microwave oven. I was telling this story quite innocently on a Zoom a week or so ago, and somebody immediately interjected and saying it kills all the vitamins in your food. And so, anyhow, we have a microwave oven. I happen to consider that it's a very energy efficient way doing certain kinds of cooking. But our microwave broke down. So we ordered up another one, and it came, but it was too big. Just didn't sit right. So we ordered another one, and it came and it was broken. So there we were, with these two huge big boxes of microwave ovens, and the carrier was meant to come and pick them up, but the carrier didn't turn up. And so here we are, got these blinking microwave ovens sitting in the hall and so on. And Varen, my wife, she says, well, you could take it down to the shop that's run by a Scottish Pakistani guy down the road. They take Hermes deliveries there. So she said, the only thing is they don't have much room in the shop. So I thought, well, I'll try it anyway, see what happens. So I go down and get this huge box out of the car, number 1 of 2. And I go into the shop, and one of the shopkeepers just looks at me and he's shaking his head. And I can see the pile of returns for Hermes piled up there, and it's mostly small packages. And he says, oh, we can only take small packages. He said, it's not just us, it's a guy who picks them up, he's not got a lot of room in his van and so on. We don't take big packages here. And I'm saying that, his colleague, who turns out to be the boss, he's serving another customer, he's working at the till. And so I just hold a bit, and I because I'm thinking, how am I going to get rid of these things? I just hold a bit, and I wait to see if I can catch the eye of his colleague, and maybe, he might, if I get rid of one of them, then it's easier to have just one knocking on the house. And so the colleague serves the other customer and looks at me and says, no, he says, it's not just us, it's at the, it's not us, he said, it's the carrier. The carriers often don't like taking big things, then we're left with them. And I say, oh, well, okay. So I start a bit dejectedly going out of the shop, and he said, I'll tell you what, he said, you can leave it here, but leave me a number. And if the carrier won't take it, you'll have to come and pick it up. I said, oh, that's really kind of you, thank you. So I'm not going to mention the other one out in the car. So I lay down this one, and I give him a business card with my number on it. And he starts looking at the card and saying, Alastair, are you Alastair McIntosh? I said, yes. He says, and you write books? I said, yes. Soil and Soul. I said, how do you know? Oh, Alastair McIntosh, put the box down here. I said, I've got another one out in the car. He said, bring it in, bring it in. I said, but how come you came across my book? He said, 10 years ago, I had a shop in a different part of town. He said, you're not recognizing me, but you gave me a copy. You gave me a copy. Now, it's just kind of, I call it the parable of the microwave ovens. You just never know. How does the magic happen? How does the magic happen? Where does it happen? You just never know. There was me, a Quaker Christian, him, a Muslim of Pakistani provenance and so on. And I can't even remember giving him the book, but it's something that I sometimes do. And I sometimes do as people like that, because, whether they read it or not, it can be a meaningful thing to have a book signed by the author. And who would ever have thought it would go around in that way? And I just thought, well, there's how grace works. And all I can say, folks, is, if you're going to catch a train or something and you've got a bit of spare time, and you just keep your eyes open for somebody who might be struggling with their luggage or something like that, just say to them, do you need a hand or something like that? Or just watching out for these things, that smile to somebody, If you see somebody who might be vulnerable in a situation where racism might be an issue in a public place, just standing near them with a wee nod. If I can see that somebody is visibly Muslim, I'll say Assalamu alaikum, or visibly Hindu, Namaste, just something like that. You know, these are just all the little, I've forgotten what the question was, but, you know, it's all about the flow of grace. It's all about the flow of grace. We're cast into this world, and yet grace carries us through this world.
We'll finish with one more question.
Thank you,
Katrina, very briefly.
Oh, yeah. Were you talking to me, Joel?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So this is my question, Alastair. Thank you very much for your very long, interesting talk. And I was just talking, you were talking about the swimming pool, and I was imagining that you're not at the shallow, splashy end. And when you dive into the water and you've learned to breathe under the water, and you open your eyes under the water, what do you see?
God. That's what makes the water deep. You see it, you know, you see into heaven. Sorry, I keep looking down. You're down here on my screen. I should be looking up at the camera. You know, what I loved about the parable of the microwave oven was just the joy we both experienced of that connection. And that, you know, 10 years ago, I'd done a small thing for him, and now he was doing something for me. And it wasn't the transactionality about it that mattered. It was that in both situations, we were recognizing each other. And, you know, the divine, for me anyway, the divine breaks through in those moments. So that's what I see. And that's why Katrina and other folks still here with us. For me, the work of spiritual activism is deepening on our spiritual journeys through our action in the world. You know, Jesus was an activist too. He was concerned to see that the people were fed in the various versions. 6 versions. Yeah, the miracle that is most common is the feeding of the multitudes is told 6 times in the Gospels. Feeding the people. And you know, I only noticed the other day this amazing bit in John 6 where I've been rereading John recently, not read it for many years, except odd wee bits, and I'm rereading it through. At the moment, Jesus feeds the 5,000, and there's this amazing passage I'd never noticed before. By lovely wee drawing there of it, and you've got, you know, after they'd picked up all the bread, and Jesus says, "Pick up the pieces left over. Let us not waste a bit." Very good ecological point being made there. The people there, seeing this mighty work that Jesus had done, said, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come to the world." Jesus knew that they were about to come to get him and make him king by force. So he went off again to the hills by himself. He went off again to the hills by himself because they wanted to make him king by force. And this is a good point to end, because what they wanted to do was to appropriate spiritual power. They wanted him to be their king because they wanted that spiritual power to be in place. Think of the 3 temptations of Christ: to turn stones into bread, the temptation to abuse the powers of nature, to take on kingdoms, to become a landowner, a rentier, the temptation to abuse the power of land and property and politics and military might and what have you, the temptation to abuse social powers, the abuse of the power of nature, the abuse of social power, and then to jump from a high place, and God will send all God's angels to rescue you. The temptation to put God to the test, and more than that, to do it as a spectacle where everybody will see. Because then the people will want to take your power and use it, take it by force, take it by violence, and use it, not for empowerment, but for power over. And so the work of spiritual activism, as we deepen in that pull, needs to be the work of understanding how we engage with power, and that the name of the game spiritually is surrendering our own power to the way of God, the way, the truth, and the life. And I point out in Riders in the Storm that in the Sanskrit that Gandhi worked with, where he made the same point, Gandhi's term satyagraha, meaning truth force or soul force. The word satya means both truth and reality, as Gandhi points out. Satyagraha, the force of reality, of spiritual reality. And similarly, in the New Testament's original Greek, the word that gets translated for truth, the truth will set you free, I am the way, the truth, and the life, those kind of statements. The word is aletheia, which equally means reality revealed. Look it up on Bible Hub and you'll see the etymology explained there. So in both the Hindu Sanskrit tradition and the Christian Greek tradition, the word used for truth, respectively satya and aletheia, equally means reality. This will draw us deeper into reality. It will draw us out of the delusions of unreality, of denial, of alarmism, of whatever it might be in whatever contexts, and deepen into the truth of God. So I believe that that is what we progressively, and backwards and forwards, you know, the vision clouds all the time. We see but through a glass darkly. But I believe that that is the deepening that we need to call on, and that we do it like those, you know, Celtic monks and priests that Father Darrell Morrow talked about. We do it by the work on ourselves, but work that is not insulated from the society around us, but which is connected with it. Hence, you know, the importance again of walking through the hells of the world, of the places of compromise and all the rest of it, and being rainmakers in our times, or at least asking that, you know, if it be your holy purpose, then we be called into those roles. And when you play that role, you step into it. When you're no longer required there, you step back out of it. You don't say, this is my role. I am now a rainmaker. I am now a prophet. I am now a guru this and that, or a reverend bishop this or that. You don't stay stuck in those roles. You play those roles when asked to come forward, whether by others or by the inner calling of the Spirit. And then you step back out of them. What you step back out of them, you step back out of them into the place of prayer, into the place of patience, into the place of deep waiting for the coming. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming, of the realized eschatology.
Thank you so much, Alastair. That was, whew. Once again, I want to thank you for your time. You have got incredible stamina to be thinking so nimbly. And I think the thing that I can take from this book and some of your other books is there's a joy that wells up when we realize that we're not, and we don't need to be in a position of fear or a sense of being impotent, you know, in terms of being activists, and actually in being in an organic growing community, that we're actually in a place where we are going to grow. And I mean, we're just at a time where people are quite depressed and feeling like, what can I do? And I think what you're writing and your words and encouragement do is to give us courage, one, encouragement, but also to show actually together there's change is happening, and we can be change makers. So really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, folks. Thank you, and bless you. God bless your holy work. That's what it is.
Let's all say goodbye.
Unmute to say goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Alastair, when you die, can I inherit your library, please?
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Oh, did you hear my joke just then?